I'm Saraya Wintersmith. Tonight on Greater Boston, GBH reporter Tori Bedford joins me on the latest with pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses across the state. Plus, what's the right way for school officials to respond to these protests? Is there one? We'll hear from the executive director of the ACLU of Massachusetts, who says many have gone about it all wrong. Protesters are still camping out at Harvard and MIT, demanding their universities cut ties to Israel over the country's attacks on Palestinians in Gaza.
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Today, protesters at MIT blocked a parking garage entrance before Cambridge police broke up the protest, making several arrests. And at UMass Amherst earlier this week, administrators called police to break up the encampments, arresting around 130 people. GBH News' Tori Bedford has been following the protests closely. She joins me now with the latest. Tori, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You were on site this week. What can you tell me about those dual demonstrations that happened? Was it at MIT?
Yes, so MIT has seen a number of counter-protesters come in. Earlier this week, there were more than 100 people that came out to the steps across the street, and it was for sort of a pro-Israeli counter-protest. They had a police detail. They blocked off all of Mass Ave, and they had fenced. The police had come in earlier in the day and fenced, put in fencing and kind of a curtain around the actual encampment, where they had about 30 to 40 tents. Some of the counter-protesters had come over to the other side. They're hanging the Israeli flag. They were hanging, their own posters. And now there's a poster outside the encampment that says, don't take down anyone else's whatever. So there's just this mix of kind of messages out there. And then a second there were counter-protesters. I call them that because they came over to, speak with and engage and yell at with a megaphone the pro-Palestinian protesters in the encampment, but they had come there for this pre-planned Israel Day, so Israelis Day of Independence. They had come to the Kresge lawn, which is where the encampment is, and they had planned to come there and have a celebration and have some food and some music. And they said that the university had told them to go somewhere else. I reached out to MIT, and they had suggested other locations. They didn't cancel the event. They just alerted, the Cambridge police and MIT police and let them know that both events were going to be happening. They were pretty peaceful, I think. What I've seen at MIT is that the encampment itself is very peaceful. There hasn't really been a ton of conflict. Every once in a while, a counter-protester will come into the encampment, and, earlier this week we saw a couple of professors come in. They'll bring a loudspeaker or a megaphone and tell, protesters there, shame on you. I saw this independent blogger come in, and he was kind of yelling and trying to confront and stir up things with the encampment. But the encampment itself, the protesters are very peaceful. I think, they really just want to stay on message. They're asking the university to cut ties with the Israeli Defense Ministry. There's some financial data that was published by this Scientists Against Genocide group at MIT, and it shows that since 2015, the university has received about $11 million in funding from the Israeli Defense Ministry. So they do a lot of, engineering, and they get a lot of military funding in general, and they're working on a lot of these innovations for military stuff, drones and rockets and the design of these things, right? And
I want to help people understand just the counter-protesters.
Yeah.
What were they saying while they were there?
So a lot of them said, shame on you. Some of them have said that, they support Israel. They are really focused on the message of hostages who are being held by Hamas and bringing, those Americans and Israeli, getting them out of the people who were kidnapped. They're really focused on the message of the hostages. They've come in and I think been expecting sometimes a fight. There was this one counter-protester in particular, Shabbos Kestenbaum, who came in and he was saying, he got in sort of a conflict with the Cambridge chief of police. He was saying, I don't need you to escort me. Why isn't it safe for me to come in as a man, a Jewish man wearing a kippah and coming in and, waving an American flag? So the chief of police escorts him in. He walks around. Everyone kind of ignores him. He yells, shame on you to everyone. He walks back out. And there were a number of Jewish pro-Palestine protesters who were there, some of whom were wearing kippahs. So I was talking to them, and I was like, hey, do you feel safe here? And what was really interesting to me was that one of them told me that he initially didn't know if he would feel safe or if he would make others feel safe by wearing a kippah. So he kind of went to, his girlfriend goes to MIT, he kind of wanted to see what that experience was like, and he felt entirely safe. And then another Jewish pro-Palestine protester told me that he feels like a lot of Jewish people who are against Israel, they feel like a minority in this movement. So, the counter-protesters who are pro-Israel were saying, we're here to tell Jewish students at MIT you are not alone. And he was saying, well, I'm saying the same thing. I want Jewish students who are against Israel's military actions to know that they are not alone and that we are also a part of and represented in this movement. So right now, there were a number of suspensions that were issued at MIT yesterday, and then, as you mentioned, today a number of arrests have occurred. We saw the footage of police scuffling. There was a lot of chaos over there today. At Harvard, there's been a lot of talk about those suspensions coming down. The university, as long as the protest is peaceful, they really don't have as much grounds to break it up unless these students are suspended, in which case they're on campus property, they're trespassing, which is then a misdemeanor. And so I was thinking this week that, we would start to see more arrests after the suspensions had gone through.
What do you make about the students' resolve, just given that they were out there again today, a day after MIT started issuing suspensions?
A number of students who were, Monday at 2:30 was the deadline to clear out the encampment or face suspension or expulsion or some kind of other, consequence. And a lot of them stayed. There were 5 who completely stayed the whole time, and then people rushed back in, rebuilt the encampment. I spoke to students who said that this, calling on the university to divest, calling on the university to really analyze where their endowment is going, where their students' tuition is going, like where they're putting their money towards, that is worth more to them than a degree. And I'm talking about, I spoke to one undergrad who told me that, she's supposed to be graduating in like a few weeks, right? Like this is really the end of her time at MIT. Another 7th year PhD student who's supposed to be graduating in August. And he is an international student who, he could lose his visa. And this is so important to them, this message, and not just the message, but this protest, this action calling on the university to divest, that they're saying this is worth absolutely everything to us. This is worth more than getting a degree. We're willing to sacrifice this if it means that we can actually hold the university to account, because we've done a number of protests about this since October 7th, and we haven't really felt that they've been feeling the heat from this, that they've been really feeling the pressure. But this is the one thing that's really making the university uncomfortable in this way and forcing them to act. And so it's working in their eyes.
I want to ask you one last thing in light of that point. What do you make of President Biden warning about withholding certain weapons if the Israeli military launches an offensive in the city of Rafah? Do you read that as a sign that student protests are reaching a higher level, that they're making some impact in the international conversation?
I think so. I think that he's definitely paying attention. He's definitely looking at, across the country, we've seen this widespread movement. And if we look at this historically, movements like this have made a real difference. I've also seen videos of children, Palestinian children in Gaza, thanking these students at these universities. And so, sometimes you'll go to the university and talk to students and they'll say, well, we really need to focus eyes on Gaza. This is what's important. Don't talk to us about what we're dealing with on the ground. But ultimately, what they're doing is all channeling back towards where Israel would be without U.S. support. And Israel would be extremely, much, much weaker without this extreme support from the West and from the U.S. and all of the Western nations that have supported Israel and pumped military help into Israel and given them weapons and financial support and recruitment and training and all of these other things that we do. And so I think President Biden, it shows that he is definitely paying attention. It shows that these protests are having an impact.
And Tori Bedford, you'll keep paying attention on behalf of GBH. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Saraya.
As pro-Palestinian protesters have camped out on college campuses across the country over the last few weeks, administrators have struggled with how to respond. Here in Massachusetts, we've seen a wide range of approaches, from mass arrests and police sweeps of encampments at Emerson College and Northeastern University to administrators meeting with protesters to discuss their demands to divest from Israel. And earlier this week, UMass Amherst called police to break up the encampments there, arresting more than 100 people. That case in particular has drawn a lot of criticism, including from my next guest. Carol Rose is the executive director of the ACLU of Massachusetts. She wrote in a statement, quote, "When universities involve police in nonviolent demonstrations, it escalates tensions and creates unacceptable safety risks for all students, faculty, and community members." She joins me now, along with Amahl Bishara, a professor of anthropology at Tufts University, and Robert Pape, a University of Chicago political science professor and the director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. Carol Rose, Professor Bishara, Professor Pape, thank you so much for being with me today. Carol, I want to start with you. You issued that statement regarding the response of officials at UMass Amherst. Why did that raise alarms for you and the ACLU?
Right. Well, right now we're at a moment in America where we have to try to find a balance between having a reasonable response to these campus protests and also making sure that we both keep the peace and keep the ability to keep free speech that's so vital in a democracy. And getting that balance right is incredibly important. At UMass Amherst, one of the concerns that we had was that the police were also preventing journalists from covering what was going on and legal observers from providing legal protection and cover for people. So the ACLU is trying to gather more facts in all of these situations. But most of all, we're trying to advise university and college administrators that calling in the police really needs to be a last resort, not simply because of any legalities involved, but because of the wisdom of calling in the police. It often escalates the tensions and actually makes things less safe rather than more safe.
I want to get into principles that universities should keep in mind for responding a little bit later, but staying with you now, Carol, and regarding MIT today, we know that the school has begun issuing suspensions for students involved in the protests. Is the ACLU monitoring that situation, and is it raising alarms for you there as well?
Yeah, so we're trying to gather more information in all of the different schools. I mean, Massachusetts has so many colleges and universities, it's a lot to cover. And we're trying to watch for things. Obviously, any kind of excessive use of force would be a concern. But we also want to make sure that any restrictions that are put on the students are reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, and that they're applied regardless of viewpoint. So everyone who's involved needs to be treated the same under the law.
In the case of UMass Amherst, the school's Board of Trustees has issued a statement expressing unwavering support for the Chancellor Javier Reyes there. And at the same time, pro-Palestine faculty groups have issued their own statement that's critical of the Chancellor, saying that his calling the police in represented a failure of leadership. Robert Pape, I want to go to you and ask, the issue obviously splits faculty and administrators in some places. Is there a similar split where you're at?
You mean at the University of Chicago? What I would say is I've been to our encampment just before it was taken down, and this is my sense is extremely different than the 1960s. So in the 1960s, it was students, faculty versus the administration. This is student versus student, and people are really divided. And the reason is because the whole issue of being pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel is extremely divided. You see, to get under the waterline, I just conducted a nationally representative survey of 5,000 college students. I'd encourage the ACL to come to our website at the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats, because it's the only national survey now in existence. You may not even really know about it, but it's been now quite widely circulated among university leaders, Congress, the administration, and it really helps us to understand that there are protest and free speech issues, but there are also campus fear issues that go beyond speech. 56% of Jewish students report being in fear of personal danger. 52% of Muslim students report feeling in personal danger. 16% of students not Jewish and not Muslim report being in personal danger. So this is not just a Jewish or Muslim issue, but it is, and this issue of campus fear is actually impacting quite a large number, 2 to 3 million college students, not just small segments as you might think, because we're watching on TV like a soda straw view of this. Well, the fact of the matter is this is what university leaders are trying to deal with. They're trying to deal with actual acts of intimidation, not simply speech, that occur in a flash. They occur very, very quickly. And that is encouraging people to be very afraid. And that's really just quite a difficult thing when you have protesters, counter-protesters, people from outside the university campuses, and basically pretty, divisions. We're a polarized country, and we're seeing polarization on campus.
I want to stick with you here and ask you your thoughts on those sort of reports of expressions of fear or discomfort. How do we square those with reports of largely peaceful protests that involve tents and signs?
Oh, completely normal. I studied political violence for 30 years. If you go to any actual war zone, civil war, you would find 90% of the country is completely peaceful. That does not mean everything is peaceful. So George Floyd protests, 7% of them were riots. I studied them in the top 100 cities in America. That 7% who were riots doesn't mean 100% were peaceful, but it doesn't mean the other 93% were not peaceful as well. So it is completely common in these hyper-tense situations to have the mixture. And that's why cookie cutter solutions send in the National Guard or just make all concessions, they really just don't really work. That wouldn't work in solving civil wars around the world, and it wouldn't really work here across the 75 campuses that have varying degrees of being impacted in the last few weeks. So it really is, I would not want to Monday morning quarterback these leaders. I think they're doing their best to juggle both of the issues of giving maximum freedom of expression, but taking seriously student fears, because these are now documented. We have 1,000, this again, nationally representative surveys, not simply anecdotal journalism, 1,000 students reporting in text boxes the details of cars trying to run them over, headscarves being pulled off, necklaces with the Jewish star being ripped off, people chasing them in their dorm rooms. This is not really just like minor issues. And so it really is the case that university leaders need to take seriously the maximized freedom of speech, but also personal safety on campus is a real issue now.
I want to come back to this idea, but first, Professor Bishara, I'm bringing you in. What's it been like seeing and hearing faculty at odds with administrators and power players at Tufts? I think you've been part of the effort to bridge the gap between protesters and the administrators who are struggling to respond.
I think a vibrant university is always made up of its students, its faculty, and its staff at the very heart of the university. As faculty members, we are often in conversation and playing that role, bridging between students and higher level administration. Faculty members are in the classroom every day. We have contact every day with our students, and we enjoy and learn from our students every day. So it's very natural that we should be in communication with administrators to bring that, close to the ground experience into those conversations.
We've heard from a number of professors, including Sally Haslinger from MIT, who has said she's horrified with how the school is suspending students. Take a listen to this.
The students cannot graduate if they're seniors. Their visas will be revoked. Their financial aid will be revoked. But this is without due process, right? Because they haven't gone through due process, because that takes a long time. They have to have hearings, they have to provide evidence and such like that. So the thought that they're going to suspend them and have these very serious life-changing consequences without due process is very horrifying to me.
Professor Bishara, staying with you, is it jarring to think that students and in some cases faculty too are both at risk of arrests or losing their jobs if they participate in this arguably political speech?
Yeah, of course, it's alarming. And, as faculty, we want to protect our students, to cultivate that atmosphere for learning, for civic engagement, and for free expression and protest on what is one of the, issues of justice that, truly will shape our generation and their generation. These students are acting on principled stances for justice, on an urgent global issue of concern that the United States is at the center of. And these students are making themselves vulnerable in a multitude of ways. putting their degrees on the line, sometimes their housing, their jobs, and their safety on the line. I have tremendous respect for their perseverance and bravery.
I want to bring in this clip now from David French, opinion columnist for the New York Times, who was on the PBS NewsHour. He said students should be allowed to protest, but not to the extent that their activity infringes on other non-protesting students' rights to be comfortable and learn and walk around their shared campus.
Well, the bottom line is that these universities have a legal obligation to protect the rights of all of the students and also to protect the Jewish students on campus from anti-Semitic harassment. So when these encampments violate the rights of others and they refuse to leave, then sometimes there's no option but to bring in law enforcement. Now, that doesn't mean that law enforcement can do whatever it wants. It should be disciplined, it should be restrained in its use of force. But when a group of students is violating the rights of other students, there are legal obligations that attach to the university to defend the rights of others. And so if these students won't move, the universities, in many ways, their hands are tied because they cannot continue to consent to the violation of other students' rights.
And he goes on to argue that universities are sort of neglecting the legal and reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions that guide First Amendment rights. Carol Rose, what about this idea that college campuses are becoming hostile places for non-protesting students, and particularly Jewish students?
Well, I would say a couple of things. First, to be sure, college administrators have a tough job, and they have to balance the protections for an ability to learn, regardless, and not to be harassed under Title VI and under anti-harassment laws. But that's really different. Like being uncomfortable with an idea that's being in the marketplace is very different than having your headscarf ripped off or having your necklace ripped off. That's assault and battery, and that's a crime. So far, the only real place that we've heard about a lot of violence was at UCLA, where counter-protesters were allowed to attack an encampment, and the police stood by. So that's, for the most part, there are exceptions, and I'm sure that Mr. Pape has documented those. But for the most part, these have mostly been peaceful, and the particular places where these have been peaceful has been on university campuses when administrators have actually reached out, not given in to demands, but agreed to open up a dialogue, to have a negotiation, a conversation. So places like Northwestern, places like University of Minnesota, Rutgers, a lot of these places where the administrators have agreed to at least listen and not just say, we're here to give you 1 hour notice. That's not a negotiation. And if the universities mean anything in our democracy, it has to be that we're teaching the students that they need to enter into negotiations, into conversations, not just with people who they agree with, but with people they disagree with. And that's why the First Amendment is so important. Nobody's suggesting that there's a right to harass people or to violate their rights or attack them. But there isn't a right just to be comfortable all the time. And that's not what the job of the university should be in any event.
And to that point, what's the line for you that, when crossed, would appropriately or rightfully trigger a police response with these encampments?
It's very fact specific, but obviously if somebody's being attacked, if their headscarf's ripped off, if they're threatened, if there's incitement, if there's harassment. I mean, there are lots of legal protections. Free speech does not mean a free for all. And so I think that there are lots of instances where the police can and should get involved. And certainly assault and battery is an obvious one. But I think that's very different than what's actually happening across our universities and college campuses, except for in the places where the police have been called in. And I think the problem is when you call the police in, especially when you do it too quickly, it tends to escalate the violence, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is why we're hoping that university and college administrators will actually work to open up a dialogue. Again, not to necessarily agree or concede to anything, but to at least have a dialogue and listen, because that's really what we do in a democracy, not just shut it down. That just drives it underground where it bubbles up, often in a more violent form.
Professors Bishara and Pape, I'm going to give you two the last word here. 20 seconds if you can. What principles should schools lean on to ensure that campuses are safe and comfortable places of learning for everyone, but that they're also a place where people can express their opinions on this issue? Professor Bishara?
I very much agree about the introduction of police into the atmosphere. We know also that, for example, Professor of History Steve Tamari, who's a 65-year-old professor, had multiple ribs broken as police were called onto campus. So that's very, very dangerous. I also want to just respond to something from the David French interview. So many leading participants in these protests have actually been Jewish students and Jewish professors, right? Jewish activists have in fact led the US-based movement against this war, and especially in the early weeks, in so many different ways. I will never forget those visible protests in US Congress, Statue of Liberty, Central Station, Grand Central Station. So I think that sort of making assumptions about who is made uncomfortable and why, really dismisses the diversity of this movement, right? Administrators need to understand who the students are who are participating on this, understand that they're coming to this with a great deal of conviction about, what they need to do to keep each other safe and to stop this war.
I need to move to Robert Pape. Close us out. 10 seconds.
University of Chicago is famous for the principles of Chicago without discomfort. This goes way beyond discomfort. What you see in our campus fear report is evidence that students feel terrified to speak up, either being pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, for fear of being academically punished on campus, and for fear of being punished in very severe ways. And they report this hundreds of times, not once or twice. I just encourage people to go to the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats Campus Fear Study. It is 455 pages long, so there's a lot there, but all the evidence is there, not simply like bottom line summaries.
All right. Thank you so much, Carol Rose, Amahl Bishara, Robert Pape. That's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. I'm Saraya Wintersmith. Good night.
Wait, did I just commit a crime? Hey folks, I'm Edgar B. Harwick III from GBH's Curiosity Desk, where you ask questions and I find answers. Today's question comes courtesy of Betty Davis from Gloucester, Massachusetts, who wants to know, is it in fact a crime to remove these labels? Now, you find these guys on pillows, mattresses, even a lot of winter coats, and the reason why is because you cannot see what is inside of those items. Now, today, pillows, for example, are usually stuffed with feathers or cotton or some kind of synthetic material. But, according to Maggie Terry, back in the day, they put some pretty gnarly stuff in the stuffing.
I mean, it used to be years ago, they'd throw anything they wanted to into the bedding. Newspapers, dirty rags.
Horsehair, used hospital or hotel mattresses, corn husks.
Sweepings off the floor, part of their lunches, droppings, I mean, anything.
For starters, that's disgusting, and furthermore, it's dangerous and unhealthy. So today, a lot of states require these labels that tell you what is inside of the item, and it is against the law to remove them. Sort of. Retailers and manufacturers can be fined if they remove the labels, but once you buy it or I buy it, if you read closely, most of these end with the line, except by the consumer. So there you have it. Feel free to rip away. Don't forget to follow and tell us what you are curious about, because hey, I might just look into it for you. I'm Edgar B. Harwick III. Stay curious out there.